Hello everyone, I love you and I hope you're all having a wonderful week. Today I'd like to talk about divine delays. So what is a divine delay? A divine delay is when we have a need or a want from God, but God makes us wait for His answer and for His movement in our life. God does not always immediately answer our prayers or immediately move in our lives the way we want Him to do. Sometimes He requires us to wait a while before we see God move. And so that's a divine delay. That's when God makes us wait for His timing. And waiting on God can often be very frustrating. And it seems like time just stands still. It seems like God's never going to act. He's never going to move. And we're just kind of stuck in neutral. And I know for me personally, I tend to be a very impatient person. I like things to happen pretty quickly. And so sometimes waiting on God can be quite frustrating. But we have to wait on God. It's important to wait on God because it has to be in His timing. In order for everything to work perfectly and to work into our favor the way that God has it planned, everything has to be in His timing. And see, the problem is oftentimes we like to rush, and our timing is quicker than God's. But see, we need to wait for God's timing because the timing must be right, and God's timing is always perfect. So oftentimes we find ourselves waiting on God for something. And maybe you find yourself waiting on God today too. Maybe you're waiting for a financial breakthrough. Maybe you're waiting for a promotion at your job. Maybe you're unemployed and waiting for a new opportunity, for God to give you another opportunity for a new job that will provide money for yourself and for your family. Maybe you're waiting for a relationship, whether that be a romantic relationship or a friendship or just any kind of relationship, someone that you can spend your life with. Maybe you're waiting for the right person. Maybe you're waiting for healing. Maybe you've been diagnosed with an illness or are sick and suffering and in pain, and you're waiting for God to heal you and comfort you. So many times we are waiting on God, and we wait on God for His guidance, His provision, for Him to act and to move in our life. And waiting is hard. But we have to remember that there is a reason for divine delays. And so we need to understand as much as we can about what divine delays are and what we can learn from them. And we see that best illustrated with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And we see that in John chapter 11. And so this whole story takes up the whole chapter of John, the whole 11th chapter of John. And so it's quite long. I'm not going to read the whole thing for us. And most of us are pretty familiar with this story anyway. We're familiar with kind of the plot line. But I want us to pretend for a second that we don't know the ending, that we don't know what happens at the end. Let's take this line by line and act like we're Martha and Mary. And so we see in John chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, it says, "Now a man was sick, Lazarus from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped His feet with her hair. And it was her brother Lazarus who was sick. So the sisters sent a message to Him, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.'" So we see right off the bat that these sisters, they have a need. They need Jesus to act. And what they're waiting for is for healing. They're waiting for Jesus to come and heal their brother. But we're going to see that Jesus puts them through a divine delay. And we can see the first thing that we can learn, the first lesson is this: delays are part of God's bigger plan to bring Him more glory. Delays are part of God's bigger plan to bring Him more glory. And we see Jesus' response in verse 4. He says, "When Jesus heard it, He said, 'This sickness will not end in death, but is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it.'" So we see that oftentimes the reason for a divine delay is so that we can bring God more glory. And that's the most important thing. And see, when we're going through a struggle, when we're waiting on God, it can be very hard on us. And the situations can be very tough. And it's often very easy for us to become self-absorbed when we're in pain and when we're waiting on God to deliver us. It's very easy for us to believe that everything is about us, That's God's main goal, is to help us, make us more comfortable, and deliver us out of this pain. It's very easy to become self-absorbed when you're waiting on God. But see, we have to remember, we need to try to see things from God's perspective. See the bigger picture. See, we're just a very small part of God's bigger plan. We're just a small part. And the bigger picture is that we are supposed to bring God glory with everything in our lives. So we need to remember that delays are a part of God's bigger plan to bring Him glory. Second, we see that delays are frustrating because God's timing is often different than we expect and want. Delays are frustrating because God's timing is different than we expect and want. In verse 5 it says, "Now Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. So when He heard that they were sick, He stayed 2 more days in the place where He was." Now see, that doesn't make sense to us. We know that Jesus loves them. And if He knew that he was sick, why did He stay? Why did He wait instead of going directly to Lazarus so that He could save him and heal him? Why did He wait? And see, we don't expect Jesus to act in that way, but He does, because He was preparing to bring God more glory. See, we have to remember, oftentimes God's timing is slower than ours, and it can look like God is not doing anything. But we need to remember that God's timing is always perfect, and it's always the best. And see, when we trust in God's timing and follow God's timing, we know that we will be where we need to be when we need to be there. And everything will work out for our best interest when we bring God the most glory. The third thing we see is that delays do not mean that God has abandoned you. Delays do not mean God has abandoned you. And in verse 11 we see that Jesus says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am on my way to wake him." So we see that Lazarus has died. We know he's died because later on down in verse 15, he says, "Lazarus has died. I'm glad for you that I wasn't there so that you may believe, but let's go to him." So let's look at this from Martha and Mary's perspective. They've called Jesus. They've told him their need. They need him. But Jesus has waited, and he has kept the sisters waiting. And now we see that their brother has died. Now in their eyes, they probably believed that Jesus had abandoned them, that He had left them to fend for themselves, and that He was not there. And oftentimes we feel the same way. When we're waiting on God and things get worse for us, it often seems like God may have abandoned us because He doesn't answer us. And sometimes we feel like that God's just not doing anything to help us. He's not moving in our lives. We don't see or feel Him moving in our lives. And so it's very tempting to believe that He isn't doing anything. But as we see here, Jesus was on His way. And God is doing the same thing with us today. Even though we may not be able to see Him, He is still working behind the scenes to help us to work things into our best interest and to give Him the most glory. So remember that delays do not mean that God has abandoned you. Fourth, we see that we are supposed to respond to God's delays with increased faith, not doubt. We need to respond to God's delays with increased faith. And so we jump down to verse 21. And this is when we see that Martha approaches Jesus. Jesus has showed up. He has arrived. And so Martha is coming out to see Him. And let's see what Martha says. Verse 21. Then Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Yet even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Your brother will rise again," Jesus told her. Martha said to Him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even if he dies, will live. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she told him. "I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who comes into the world." So we see that Martha's first comment shows, you can kind of hear a little bit of anger in there. She tells him, if you had come when we called you, this would have never happened. So she expresses her doubt and her anger. She expresses her emotions to Jesus. But then we see that Martha still believes. She still says, yes, Lord, I believe you are the Messiah. See, she didn't allow this delay to hurt her faith. She responded with an increased faith. Because oftentimes during delays, we get into situations that will deepen our faith. See, if Lazarus had never died, Jesus probably wouldn't have had this conversation about the resurrection with Martha. So see, Martha's faith was deepened by this delay. And so when we find ourselves in a delay, in a divine delay, we need to remember to keep our faith. We need to remember that God is with us. Have faith that He loves you, that He is working things in your favor, and that He will move and He will do great things for you and answer your prayers when the timing is right. So remember that we need to respond to God's delays with an increased faith. Fifth, we see that God empathizes with our emotions as we endure delays. God empathizes with our emotions as we endure delays. In other words, God understands what we're going through and He feels our emotions. And see, we see that we're going to see Mary, she comes up. In verse 32, it says, as soon as Mary came to where Jesus was and saw Him, she fell at His feet and told Him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews had come with her crying, He was deeply moved in His spirit and troubled. Where have you put him? He asked. Lord, they told him, come and see. Jesus wept. That's probably the shortest verse in the Bible, but it's also the most powerful. Jesus wept. And see, we feel a lot of emotions. And Mary was very emotional. And we also feel a lot of emotions when we're going through a delay. We may feel anger or doubt. We may be anxious or bitter. Or maybe we're just full of doubt and depression and grief, as Mary was. And oftentimes we feel that God just really doesn't care how we feel. He sees us hurting, but yet He's not doing anything. So He must not care that I'm hurting. He must not care that I'm going through this. But we see that Jesus wept. Even though He knew the ending to the story, Jesus wept anyway because He feels our emotions and He empathizes with us. So remember that God always cares about what you're going through. And finally, we see that delays bring bigger and better blessings than we could ever ask for. Verse 43 says, after he said this, He shouted with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, bound head and foot with linen strips and with his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, unwrap him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what He did believed in Him. So we see that Jesus gave them a much bigger and better blessing because they waited. See, all they wanted was for Jesus to come and heal their brother. But instead, He came and rose him from the dead. Imagine the joy that all these people felt. And also we see that many people came to believe in Jesus because of what He did. Bringing someone back from the dead is far greater than just healing someone who is still alive. So we must remember that oftentimes delays come because God is working for a bigger blessing. He is preparing us for something bigger. I don't know what you're waiting on God for today, but I'm sure that most of us are waiting on God for something. But just remember that divine delays, all this waiting that you're doing, it serves a purpose. Keep your faith in God and just believe that when the timing is right, He will bless you better than you could ever imagine. Thank you so much for listening to me today. I hope this message touched you and blessed you. Tune in next week to hear Tracy. I'm sure he's going to have another great message for us. And just thank you for listening to me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and God bless.